Well, I want to welcome you to today's channel and the content that we have today. I'm very grateful. I just came back off of my sabbatical, and it was amazing. And now it's time to get back to work. Now it's time to do the work that God has called me to do. And I've got a very special guest with me today, Dave Pocta. Dave is a Christian spiritual scholar, public speaker, ministry trainer. He spent the first 26 years of his career serving in full-time ministry with his wife, Beth, in the International Churches of Christ in the USA and Africa. The Poctas devoted the majority of that time to training ministry leaders and parents about family-based church cultures. David holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering, a master's degree in Bible and ministry, and hopes to finish his PhD in Christian contemporary spirituality in 2022. His research interests include the spiritual journey, secularity, ooh, got that one, biblical spirituality, and Christian mysticism. His working title for his dissertation is Lost at Sea: Why So Few Wandering Christians Find Their Way Home. Dave, welcome to the channel, brother.
Thanks. Those are mouthful words, right?
Secularity. I got that one now. That one's
secularity.
in there. That one's secularity. In there, man.
Yeah.
I'm really grateful to have you today. Part of what is so important about you joining today is what you are researching, which I believe that's a calling, is something that is so painful and so much of an experience for so many people. People feel de-skilled. They feel disoriented.
Yep.
And we need some orientation. We need a compass in terms of what's going on. And there's just a lot of questions that we're going to get to today that I'm really excited about having a conversation with you about, brother.
Yeah, me too. This is going to be a lot of fun. Let's dig.
Let's do it, man. Tell us first about your conversion and why you went into the ministry.
Okay. You know, I was really blessed to grow up in a devout home. I grew up Catholic, and my mom was actually Jewish. My dad was Catholic, but I was raised Catholic. So we were the go to church every Sunday, no matter what kind of people, which really laid a great foundation for me. When I was off at college, at University of Minnesota, I was a wayward soul. And actually for Lent one year, ironically, I decided to turn my life around. And within 2 weeks, I had 3 different groups of people reach out to me at the University of Minnesota. So God has always kind of made grand gestures in my life, and I appreciate it. I've needed it. So when I started studying the Bible, I studied the Bible in 8 days and got baptized on June 6, 1990. And I came out of the waters of baptism just so excited about the clarity of the scriptures, the call to discipleship, that to me, it just was a no-brainer. I mean, I wanted to quit school and go in the ministry. Fortunately, I had a church leader who really demanded my finishing my degree. He said, no one's going to respect you as a minister if you just drop out. So I finished and went in the ministry, but I was in the ministry within a year. I was in a ministry after my conversion. And yeah, it's just been a long, crazy, wild, exciting journey since then. How long is that now? 1990. So we're 31 years in.
So one of the things that I obviously didn't say in the introduction is that you and Beth have been around for a long time. You guys have blessed and served a lot of people. And I just kind of want to brag on you just for a moment. I think about some of the material that you've put out over the years, presentations you guys have done. You guys have helped establish a sense of biblical literacy, but not just in this theoretical or scholarly way. I think that you guys have blessed a lot of people in terms of boots on the ground. I mean, you guys have real years in the ministry with families. And I think that one of the biggest ways to minister is by serving families. And so I just want to appreciate, you guys have done a lot. You guys have done a lot through the years.
Thank you. That means a lot. I think that's always the struggle, is to pursue education and knowledge, but to make sure it's practical and helpful for people. And so that means a lot. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Let's get into your doctoral research. There's so much that you are studying and you are researching that we need to know about. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about what you're studying and why you decided to even study what you're studying?
You know, after being around the church, and serving in the ministry for so long. I think it was about 25, 26 years. In 2016, I had a kind of midlife spiritual crisis, and it led to a lot of mental health challenges for me. So I was diagnosed with depression, with anxiety, with ADHD, which that wasn't new to anybody who knew me. I was sleep deprived. I was just in a really tough space, and I didn't know where to turn. And, it was really helpful to have the medical world, the world of psychology. I went on medication for a while, which was helpful. I took a sabbatical, which was helpful. But through all that, I had a lot of questions spiritually that I couldn't answer. And one of the first things that, through a series of amazing God's grand gestures, I ended up in this PhD course at a school right down the road on John of the Cross and studied the dark night of the soul. And all of a sudden, light bulbs started going off. Ironic, right? Dark night, light bulbs. Anyway, I told you I nerd out about stuff. So I think I realized, and this all leads into my work and why I think it's important in the ICOC and all that, but we're so young as a fellowship that we don't have mentors, we don't have people to look to, we don't have the deep wells of wisdom that are in other traditions. And I found myself so fed in that environment. And then I start looking around at all my middle-aged friends and seeing a lot of that same malaise, discontent, disorientation. So a lot of it started with me going, I need this and my friends need this. And then it's morphed now into even bigger thing, which led me to my dissertation work, which is, so I did a lot of work on my own in midlife spirituality and midlife struggles and dark nights and all that. But the real issue now that we're facing is a different kind of dynamic in our churches, where a lot of our younger people are getting disenfranchised and leaving. But it's a problem not just in our church, it's a problem in Western Christianity, right? So my whole, the dissertation's entitled Lost at Sea, Why So Few Wandering Christians Find Their Way Home. And what it really looks at, I'm not looking at people who are apathetic about their faith. There's all kinds of reasons for that. I'm looking at people who love God, who want to serve God, but they find themselves in this crisis with their faith community where they can't seem to figure out the tenuous relationship they have with the church, and they end up getting untethered. And once that untethering happens, it's very rare for someone to come back. So I'm looking at all of that, right? The culture, secularity, what's going on in the church, in particular, the evangelical movement, the restoration movement that we're part of, and us in the ICOC, and all the implications of what it means to be young as a fellowship, and what we lack and what we need and how we need to grow. Anyway, obviously there's a lot there that, we could talk about, but at the core, that's what my work is about.
And what are some unique trends that people who leave the church or who have been stuck tend to possess?
Well, so let me start by just saying there are certain kind of universal spiritual truths that we don't always understand, especially because we're young. And one of those is the concept that we're all on a journey. What starts off as a young, simple, almost black and white, idealistic faith never stays that way. And the complexities that come with growth, maturity on this journey are significant. And I think that's why there's a tendency to fundamentalism, to want to just make things simple, to make them black and white, to have the answers. But life's not that way. Spiritual life is certainly not that way. And I think one of the things that we forget is, even look at Israel, right? The name Israel. God's people were named the strugglers who overcome. So there's this sense of the struggle is integral into our spiritual life. It's always going to be there. and we persevere and we persevere and we persevere, and with God we will overcome. So that concept of journey is so important. And I think that's one of the trends that, so when you ask what are the trends of those that struggle, those that, so we underestimate the significance of the journey. I think we also, in our fellowship, we overvalue rational thought. We come out of a tradition that's deeply embedded in rationalism because it came out of the 18th, 19th century. And of course, that was, what was so important culturally at the time. But that does not explain what really drives us, which we don't make decisions based on rational thought. We're emotional people. We're irrational, emotional people. Anger, anxiety, doubt, they drive us, right? And I mean, you look today's culture is a perfect example of this. Rational thought does not drive people's political values. It does not drive people's engagement and experience. So we've underestimated those dimensions, not to mention the spiritual realm. I mean, just simply the mystery involved in an ineffable God, this kind of beyond description creator of the universe that we want to make into this rational being when everything makes sense. It's just not real. So kind of the long answer here to your question is the unique trends are, I think as people come to realize all this complexity, it disorients, right? It greatly disorients. And I think because of our approach to our spirituality being so rational, even our hermeneutics and how we try to explain the Bible is so rational, and it's limited, right? Historical critical methodologies are super limited. They're important, but they're limited. So I think those are the trends. The trends are, yes, we're human beings. Yes, this is complex. Yes, there's a lot of mystery. Yes, we need maturity. And because we lack a lot of that maturity, people don't know where to turn. And so they get frustrated and angry and discontented, and they want, the answer seems to be to leave.
One of the things that I think that I'm really excited about this conversation, because as you're talking, my research with trauma, it's almost like there's a parallel process occurring here. And one of the things that I think that we see when it comes to trauma is that ideally what happens is on our spiritual journey, we hit these developmental milestones. Well, what trauma does is it makes it difficult to evolve and to continue to hit your developmental milestones. So what happens is when people who are impressionable, I'm not saying our movement attracts impressionable people, but I think many faith orientations attract impressionable people. I think there's this point where people are missing developmental milestones in their spiritual journey. And then later we have to find a way to go back and do developmental repair. And I do this with trauma with people, but spiritually and in the ministry, I'm noticing it's the same thing for people who leave or people who've been stuck typically. And you see it with people in addiction. People stop evolving and they stop maturing, they stop developing at those entry points of trauma. So say, for instance, someone has a leader who does something and says something, it sticks, boom, trauma creates rigidity with those associations. And then their understanding of what we are or what this is, it freezes. It almost goes on ice and it stops evolving. So what I find is some people, the trends that I find, people have been stuck for a long time. And it's not, I wouldn't say commitment, but I think some people are just, they stay stuck because of constraint. They fear, there's just a lot of fear, and I think some people stay because of constraint, but they are not evolving. They're not maturing, right? And so I think that's part of what I want to do. And I really look forward to reading your research and so forth, because I want to start to see where some of those, like specifically where those areas that people are not developing. And I think your research is going to be helpful for helping young movements understand what are those developmental milestones that we need to make sure we're hitting, not just individually, but collectively. And so your research is very exciting to me.
I love what you're saying. I mean, so this concept of development, right? I mean, it's funny, we have a grandchild now, and
that's crazy, bro. You do not look like you have a grandchild.
Oh my gosh, she's just a peach. She's so much fun. She's 7 months old. And,
oh, what's her name?
Her name's Eden Claire. So it's so interesting how we accept development physically, we
Mm,
accept it educationally, we accept it um emotionally, right? I mean, so she goes into the doctor every month and there's milestones that she's checked for, and if she's not doing something at a certain stage, there's intervention really quickly. And so we have these metrics,
yeah.
right? In the spiritual realm, even though it is much more complex and it's not linear as linear as physical development, but there's absolutely development. But in the church, in our church in particular, we do not have those metrics. We don't know how to measure spiritual growth and maturity, what it looks like, and what am I working towards. And that's been a huge part over the last 5 years of my work. And so, we've learned so much from ego development, not ego in the sense of pride, but ego in the sense of identity development from the world of psychology. A lot of that work's been integrated into the faith community of understanding stages of faith and stages of development. And there's a lot of great people have written about this, but it's not even new. I mean, this is John of the Cross's whole kind of spiritual itinerary back 500 years ago was addressing spiritual development. It goes back to the 4th century. I mean, Gregory of Nyssa. This has been looked at and studied for a long time, but young reform movements don't have those tools. So we don't even know, oh, you've been a Christian for 20 years and you're here spiritually and you shouldn't, there should be more we don't even know how to talk about it.
Well, I think that, and this is where trauma comes in. I think we have an interpretation heritage that is overly binary. I mean, part of it is, our 4-part or 5-part, like looking for the pattern, right? And I
Yeah.
think that pattern and the desperation for a pattern is based in trauma and is based in negative experiences and survival. And I think that when people are in survival mode, they don't have the ability to have a theological imagination. And that's what trauma does, is it limits our theological imagination, which is the opposite of what Jesus comes and he blows the doors off.
That's
And
right.
I think that so it's interesting you talk about how, like, there's just a lack of curiosity. We'll just say curiosity.
Yeah.
And
Good.
sociologically, it's interesting. They have found that people who have a really, really high need for closure in terms of, like, they need conclusion, they need finality in terms of doctrine. They typically rush to bias. They typically will be early to stereotype. And part of that personality structure, and you see it, when you evaluate people psychologically, is that there's this dimension of being overly concrete. Now, if you think about that for a moment, it kind of makes sense because, when people want security. And,
Yeah.
if a doctrine or, preacher sermons can give people security,
Yeah.
that people want that. And so I wonder if it's some of these issues, there's these primal needs underneath for security and belonging,
Yep.
and those types of things that are running some of the things up here. And so I just look forward to your research, really, and you probably have already, researched some of it, really getting into some of that too, because there's some primal stuff down here.
Well, what you're addressing is what drove the Reformation and
Mm,
why it became so problematic. I mean, so this need for certainty,
mm,
right? I mean, you think about the opposite of certainty, it's anxiety.
mm.
Anxiety and certainty drove Martin Luther. It drove that bifurcation of Catholic versus Reform. At the core, you had to make a decision. Do I value my piety, my unity with the church, my loyalty to the faith community, or do I value some sort of intellectual, rational certainty that I can base more on a scriptural presence? And that's a lot of the decisions that were made with whether you went Catholic or Protestant, even back in the 16th century. But that need for a certainty and understanding that I know the right thing and I know where I'm at with God, and it certainly drives us, it drives our movement. And when that gets eroded and we start getting anxious about things, that's what disorients us. So that core emotional, underpinning is a challenge. It's always been. It's part of our human nature.
Let me ask the next question. This one's a loaded one, so I'm going to give you a moment to really just take your time on this one. What are some ways that we will have to adapt to the way that church fellowship and perspectives are changing? And what role does generational tension play in the matter?
Yeah, that's a loaded one. Um,
Take your
and
time, bro.
yeah, that second part's even, maybe we can parse that out after the first one. I mean,
Sure.
so my goal in my dissertation work is to write a prescription for the church. That's the end goal of what the last chapter will be, based on all the research and observations. I think so. Let's focus just specifically in maybe more kind of contemporary, what I call Bible-centric spiritualities, churches that hold Scripture to be the ultimate authority. Which what I would put the International Churches of Christ in, Restoration Movement churches, a lot of evangelicals in. The first thing we have to look at is maturity. We've got a lot of work to do to grow up. We talked a little bit about that already, but we've got to be able to accept a move away from idealism. I think we're being forced to do that in our marriage and family lives. That things just don't turn out the way you think.
Oh man.
Right? And how do you theologically process that is so important, but it forces you away from an idealism and to understand more the struggle, to understand more development, to understand the complexities of life. So that's huge, maturity. Another one that we've already briefly mentioned is mentors and models. I mean, one of the things I think the church needs is people that are willing to pioneer the process, that are willing to spearhead, to go down the paths, to learn from the masters, to read, to study, to struggle. And it's easy for us to be critical of people that, used to go into the monastic life, and I've heard so many criticisms from people in our circles of, well, why would you be a monk? Because you can't share your faith and change the world that way. But there's so much that those people have to teach us, because they have devoted their life to devotion, to the journey, to understanding spiritual development. And there's so much to learn from. So we need those mentors and models, even within our own fellowship. And I think the question there is, when you think, okay, when I look at who do I want to be when I grow up, who can guide me into the next 20 years of my spiritual development? There should be 5-10 people you can think of. And I'm not sure that's the case right now. So that's huge. I think the other thing for churches is to embrace the importance of education. I'm excited to see how many are starting to go down this path now. I think that's going to be a huge step for us. But we really need more and more people who are educated to help share those gifts with the church. Another one would be recognizing giftedness. There's a word that is used a lot in Catholic circles, charism, which actually is a Greek word from charis, which is grace, right? The grace, the giftedness you've been given. What has God made you? And I think to recognize our charisms, right? I mean, I started my career as an evangelist. I spent many years serving as an evangelist, but became clear I was more gifted, not as much of a church leader as a scholar. And I think, still in our church, we aren't even sure what to do with people like me. Right? Where does a Dave Pocta fit in this? But it's not just me. I mean, it's just so many of our people are gifted in ways that are a little bit outside, or even a lot of ways outside the traditional things that we've held up and valued, which has a lot been, can you help someone become a Christian? And how many people can you help become a Christian? Which is important, but it's certainly limited in celebrating the giftedness. So we're going to need to grow into that. Why we need elders, why we need evangelists, why we need teachers, the dynamics between elders, evangelists, and teachers, which is something that we still have not grown into yet. We've got to appoint a lot more teachers, a lot more elders to create that diverse leadership. So anyway, spitballing and throwing a bunch of things out there as far as where the church needs to go. That's huge. I think we've already talked about the incorporation of journey. We have to incorporate mystery a lot more into our theology and understand the importance and role of mystery. You mentioned in my bio that I study Christian mysticism, which is, how do we understand intimacy with the divine? that's something we don't talk a lot about, and how does that work? And how do we think about that? So anyway, there's a lot there, right? Now, then you asked the question, what generational tension? Can you rephrase that part?
What role does generational tension play in the matter of what you've just said?
Well, it's so immersed in all that. I mean, the thing about generational tension is it's not new. It just changes every 30, 40 years. Young people about every 30 to 40 years come to realizations that their predecessors didn't see. They have a different cultural lens, right? I mean, think of the 60s and 70s in the United States. The younger generation had an awakening about needs within the culture that was driven by the civil rights movement, was driven by the Vietnam War. It was driven by a lot of radical it became radical rebellion. And the reason it becomes a radical rebellion is because the older generation isn't listening or participating or partnering with the younger generation. And it's understandable. I mean, you think about now what's happened now. So those that are boomers who fought all those battles, who raised all the rage in the 60s and 70s, have been fighting for some of those principles for the last 40 to 50 years. Well, now they're the leaders, they're in control of the culture and the environment. And it's almost like, okay, we've arrived, we've accomplished, we've changed the culture according to our values. Now they turn around and they look at the the millennials and the next generation, and they go, who are now raging against what they've built. Right? And they're tired. I mean,
Yep.
They've been fighting their own battles. Now they're turning around and seeing people do the same thing to them that they did to the generation before them. And it's hard.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? It's so anyway, all that's at play. And I think the difficulty and the challenge for those of us that are boomers or Xers is inclusion, conversation, listening, and accepting that there's a different perspective, particularly, and I think this is what we need to celebrate about this generation, the young generation now. They're seeing the gospel through a lens that we didn't see the gospel.
Talk to us.
They are celebrating and seeing the need for the gospel to meet needs in today's culture that we just didn't have on our radar. Now, for us, especially for those of us who helped kind of build the ICOC, the need of the hour was discipleship. It was the call to a radical commitment to Jesus Christ, because culturally that really was the need, right? And I think that's why we just flourished and exploded, because we met a great need. The need today has a lot more to do with justice. It has a lot more to do with respect, with recognizing the marginalized. And I think it's a huge need, and it's all gospel.
It's all gospel and prophets.
Yes, it's now, of course, it can take on its own worldly, agenda, but at the core of Jesus's mission was healing. It was bringing the marginalized in and helping them feel freedom and respect. And I think that's a hard shift for an institution to make. And I think that's the struggle, right? That's the struggle right now. And I think we're going to have to work really hard at listening to one another in order to start turning those corners and being relevant to the next generation. Now, I think the other thing we have to accept is that this is not abnormal. Right. This is the nature of prophets. It's the nature of reformers for thousands of years, because something in the culture needs to be addressed. The word of God can address it. There's new voices. There are those that can adapt, and there's those who can't. And I think that struggle's real, and it's always been part of human nature. So I think the question for those of us now who are in church leadership or positions of where we have authority or influence is, how humble are we? How willing are we to listen? How willing are we to engage, to keep moving, to not get stuck and settled and tired? and if we're tired, then maybe it's time to retire. It's and let the new voices come. Anyway, the Holy Spirit's working all the time. The Word of God's living and active, and the church should also be.
So this is why I'm kind of excited to have you on about this issue, because when I think about my inbox, when I think about, I mean, it could be anywhere that I get people they're dissatisfied. There's resentment, but there's unchecked disappointment that's evolved into really a sense of resignation. This is the key word that I use, especially with the baby boomer generation, is this almost being resigned. And I think it feels like some people in the older generation feel that they've become obsolete.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. I'm 52.
You're 50. Wow. Yeah,
I've been around, and I get that. It's hard. It's hard when you've built, especially you identified this really well. In the 80s and the 90s, things that worked really well don't work the same today, right? And how do you accept that? And I think this is, you mentioned also, one of the things I study a lot is secularity. Culture is, the faith is always culturally embedded, right? So this is one of the things that really hamstrings us, particularly in the ICOC, but it's true of evangelicalism and restorationism. When you take a posture that the Bible has all the answers, or patternism is a huge part of your hermeneutic, then you want to be able to go to the scriptures to just imitate or solve everything from scripture. And I'm not sure that's what the scriptures were intended to be for us, because I mean, you can look at Israel culture even in the New Testament, just the New Testament alone, when you look at the 5 pillar churches, from Ephesus to Antioch to Jerusalem to Rome to Corinth, right? These 5 pillar churches, the culture within those 5 churches was radically different from one another. And the way that those churches were led were all different. They had a different leadership structure. They had different needs that get addressed. I mean, you compare the book of Romans to 1st and 2nd Corinthians, radically different, right? Then you got in Jerusalem, James as an elder leading the church. And so you've got elder-led churches and evangelist churches. You've got Antioch, which is established by pastors and teachers. So there was an understanding even in the early church that the gospel message, the core of what we're about, which is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and how that pertains to my life, would manifest itself in many different ways, even in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. What we tend to want to do is to institutionalize that, to make it programmatic and apply it. So even if you capture something like discipleship that you see have these radical positive effects for a couple decades, but then it slows down and there's a culture shift. If we can't reapply the gospel into that culture and rethink it, then we get stuck trying to repair or take us back to something that's no longer as viable. And I'm not saying that discipleship's not always going to be viable. It is. But yeah, it's difficult. So again, I think this is why education is so important. How do we understand what's going on with us? And for the older generation, to your point, how do they understand the culture's shifting? The gospel needs are shifting. We need young voices. That doesn't mean you didn't have a tremendous impact in your life, but maybe now the goal of your life isn't to say, well, this is no longer my jam, I'm out. Mentor, help, and empower younger people to become what God needs them to become for their generation. And I think that's a big turn for a lot of older leaders, right? That my goal isn't to make you me. My goal is to help you be you in your cultural setting. That's a very different approach to leadership development.
Everything you just said touches the old and the young, because here's the reality. My generation is going to make just as many mistakes as the generation that came before us. And if we're not careful, we'll make more, but we are going to make just as many. The
Yeah.
question is, are we going to make the same mistakes?
Right.
And I think my generation has to be very careful about blaming a generation that we are in the middle of becoming, number
Yeah.
one. I
Yeah.
think the other thing Steve Staten in another video had talked about is that the baby boomer, the builder generation, right? The builder generation is concerned about legacy. That
Yeah.
there's this, we personalize it, right? And again, going to being obsolete, I do not feel at all that the builder generation is anywhere near obsolete. In fact, on my channel, you might be the youngest person I've had on my channel so far. I truly believe in getting everything I can get out of the older generation, because one day we're not going to have them.
Yeah.
And then it's just going to be on us, and all we're going to have is each other. And we're going to be in the same position they were in. And I think there's a loneliness in the older generation because they've lost all their spiritual fathers and mothers. And so I just want to, for me, I want to attune to that struggle that people have. The other thing I would say, just biblically, and I love how you broke down the 5 pillars. I haven't thought of that way, but I love how you just broke that down, specifically in Mark, in the passion prediction. At the end of the passion narrative, we see that the disciples come up to Jesus and they're like, should we stop this person? Because, they're not with us.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, Jesus, he sees right through that question. And right before we see they're arguing about who's going to be the greatest.
Yep.
And that has a little bit to do with that.
Yes, it does. Absolutely, it does.
And so the point you're making, and I think the point that Mark's making, is that you can't domesticate what God is. It can't be domesticated.
That's right.
And that, I find that you're saying, maybe to some degree, I don't want to leap too much, that maybe we've tried to domesticate something. And at times it's
what's our nature, right? Empire stands in opposition to the Holy Spirit. And whenever we try to create empire, I mean, that's what the Tower of Babel story is about. Whenever you try to institutionalize, coordinate, create empire, it stands directly in contradiction with what the Spirit's doing. And God always tends to kind of break down empire, but that's the battle. And I think that the difficulty is, as soon as we start seeing success with something, we want to package it.
Wow.
We want to industrialize it, institutionalize it, create empire. Look at us. And it happened. I mean, it happened in the ICOC. Look at us. And then it just starts breaking down. So the question, this is what I wrestle with at 52, right? I'm in the middle of the Gen X generation, right? I'm right in the middle of it. The question I pray about almost every day, and I'm constantly asking myself, and maybe it helps that I don't have a job right now, so I'm forced to think about this. What am I going to do with my life after my PhD? But the question I always have to ask myself is, what does God need me to be now? Where is God steering me? What's my role with the next generation? How can I be a voice, an advocate? How can I listen? How can I bring to bear the things I've learned to help them become what they need to become? But we have to really sit loosely in our chairs. And I think it's easy, especially when you become a church leader and you've had success and you've got a reputation, it's super easy to get rigid in how you do things.
Right.
And not sit and ask the questions, even of yourself. How do I have to grow? How do I have to change? What does God need me to be now? And I think that's the challenge for those of us that are older. We've got to keep asking those questions and sit loosely.
Love that question. It encourages me. What encouragement? I want to kind of shift a little bit, but I still want to look through the lens of your dissertation. What encouragement? This is a very important question. What encouragement do you have for those who are thinking about leaving the church? And I don't mean the church in Big C, but I mean the church in terms of what we understand
Their local
about God's
congregation.
collection of people.
Yeah. Well, I think if I were to sum it up in one word, it would be persevere. Struggle's real and it's normal. and you grow up in your family. Most of us grow up in our families thinking our parents and our family situation's awesome. And then we become adolescents and teenagers, and we start thinking it's not awesome. And then when we first move away from home. So Paul Ricoeur, who's part of my work, Paul Ricoeur was a French hermeneutic philosopher, and he used to talk about this concept of first naivete, critical stage, and second naivete. So first naivete is when you grow up and everything's just awesome. Like that's the church when you first get baptized, right? Everything's awesome. When then you go through a natural development of criticalness, you start asking questions. You start trying to figure out why. You start seeing problems. You start realizing there's dysfunction. Whether it's in your home growing up or it's in your church, there's dysfunction. And then you start realizing, well, maybe I'd be happier somewhere else. And then the more you start studying other situations, you go, well, they're dysfunctional too. So unfortunately, what that's led a lot of people to do is become spiritual, but not religious, or what's called SBNRs, people that they want a relationship with God, but they don't want a relationship with the church. And the truth is I just don't think you can be a Christian without the church. The nature of Christianity is communal. It's a communal faith. Unfortunately, especially in America, our national values rage against what Christianity at its core is. It's not about individual freedoms. There's nothing in the Bible that are individual freedoms.
Come on, bro.
What maturity is about paradox. We have to understand and embrace that there's all kinds of things about our faith that are both and. So let's use the example of Jesus at the Last Supper in John's gospel, right? Jesus is dressed in a particular way. It's part of his identity. When he goes to serve his brothers, he removes his clothes. He removes his identity to become the servant to them. After he washes their feet, he puts them back on. There's this sense of, look, I'm a middle-aged white guy who was raised in America, right? I don't know if we call yourself middle-aged. Are you middle-aged?
I'm 38, so I don't know.
Yeah, you're on the younger side.
Okay, good.
So look, for me to engage you as my Black friend, brother, and recognize that I'm a white man.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as being colorblind. That negates the individual creativity in which God made us.
Exactly.
Just as much as me being negated as a scholar, as a father, they're all part of my identity. And yet I lay down my identity when it comes to the value of the community, the Christian engagement. It's not about, it doesn't really matter that I'm white. It doesn't matter that I'm educated. It doesn't matter that whatever, fill in the blank. I think what's really important is that we recognize God made us uniquely. In fact, Michel de Certeau, who's a Jesuit scholar who recently passed, would say that every individual Christian is necessarily unique. We all have our own upbringing, the books we've read, the education we've had, the economic status we've been raised in, the culture we've been raised in, we've inherited so much genetically, and we all engage the cross and the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus in a personal sense. But the nature and the glory of God and his church is that he brings us all together in this diverse, complex individuality. And we have to work together, engage one another, lay our lives down for one another, be the kernel of wheat that dies so that, the wheat can live. And I think that's the both and, that's the paradox. How can I celebrate uniquely how God made me and yet be completely committed to my community and lay my life down for the benefit of my community? I give up my freedoms, my personal freedoms, for the benefit. I take off my cloak as Jesus did at the Last Supper. I wash the feet of my brothers and sisters. And when I'm done, I put the cloak back on and still celebrate the uniqueness and individuality of who I am.
Well, into the spirit of the question, as far as people leaving the church, I mean, the reasons why people are leaving the church are unbelievably diverse at this point. I see people leaving because of what you've just said. They don't feel like they can still be in a church anymore that has become, they feel too much in terms of secular values, or they don't feel it's on fire enough and we've lost our convictions. And so you just find these, like you mentioned paradox, but you find these end of the spectrum perspectives
Yes.
that, I think that, to your point, perseverance is so necessary to hold that tension. I think some people are just really struggling with the tension because of the world around us, and people are looking for security in changing times. And so when I think of people leaving the church, my first impulse typically is kind of like, okay, the grass isn't greener on the other side. The grass is greener where you water it. Number one.
Right. Right.
Number two, it's not usually where you go, it's how you leave.
Let me be personal. I mean, so you asked about my research, but I'll just share from my own life. I've had to count the cost many times about whether I wanted to stay in my fellowship. I feel like sometimes that's on a knife edge. I can go either way. And honestly, in particular, so in 2003, in our fellowship with churches was a really difficult time. And I'd been in the ministry for about 10 years. We were leading the youth and family, or back then the teen ministry in Chicago. There was 10 of us. Beth and I were the only ones that didn't resign. All of our peers did, all 8 of the others. And I was in a difficult space, and I had to figure out, how do I recalibrate myself? So I went to grad school in 2004, and that was to recalibrate myself. But even the grad school process made me question a lot, right? As education does. Well, going now to get my PhD after kind of a spiritual midlife crisis, when I was already disoriented, my first year in my PhD program, I genuinely thought, I don't think there's any way for me to stay part of this fellowship. My theology was changing. I was learning things. I was identifying problems, and the problem with going through that critical phase is you start looking at all the problems in great detail. And that's hard. The more you look at the problems, think about them, study them, the more you feel justified to leave. And honestly, what helped me in year 2 is I said, well, this is my family. And if I'm going to be critical of my family, I'm going to understand my family. And that's what caused me to do a deep dive into our roots. I spent a year studying Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone, Kip McKean, people that have influenced who we've become as a fellowship. I wanted to know where it came from. I wanted to know why. I wanted to understand their spirituality. I wanted to understand our hermeneutic. I wanted to know where our hermeneutic came from. I want to know the culture in which we evolved. And everyone doesn't have the ability to do that. I get that. But, I've always owned used cars, and I always have this theory with used cars. Like, I take care of my cars. And if I get tempted to sell my car and buy another used car, I'd rather know the problems I have than inherit someone else's problems. And look, the church is a mess, not because we're uniquely a mess, because the church has always been a mess. The problem that causes people the most unbelief or tendency towards atheism or desire to leave the church ultimately comes down to emotion. It's deeply rooted in anger or anxiety. We've already talked about anxiety, the need for certainty. The other side we didn't talk about yet is anger. And where our anger goes is it's usually at the moral degradation or the moral impropriety of the church. The church tears itself down because we look to the church and we're unhappy with some aspect of its morality. And then we get angry about it, and we can figure out, there's 100 things that it can be. But that anger is often what leads to us deciding to quit. Covenant is challenging. Anyone who's been married more than 10 years can attain to covenant being challenging. And we don't have a covenant per se with the church, and yet we do.
Yeah.
Our covenant with God involves the church. And to work through, push past, persevere, keep asking, keep pushing, keep trying, keep forgiving, keep showing grace. That's the nature of our battle. My first official course in my PhD program, I'm sitting in this PhD seminar with 2 nuns, another committed Catholic, and a guy who was raised Southern Baptist but became Anglican.
Oh.
Episcopalian. And, you know, I mean, PhD seminars, there's 5 of you and then the professor, and we're having this conversation, and somehow the Bible comes up and somebody makes a comment about Hinduism and accepting it. To me, it was like, I was so put off, right? And I reacted as I was somehow the defender of the word of God in the classroom. And the professor who was leading the class is actually also a Catholic nun. And you could the tension just starts rising in the class. And I know it's me. I'm the problem. I'm the defender. I'm the defensive one. I leave the class and I thought, you know what? Me taking this posture does nobody any good. If I can't sit here and humbly listen to and learn from people who've had different experiences than me, then why am I here? And that change, instead of judging people that thought differently, deciding to learn from people who thought differently. The fear that people have in that kind of ecumenical dialogue is that they're afraid that you're just going to become some soft, not have any convictions person who accepts everything. I actually think it's the opposite. What happens is, as you learn from other people, you go, wow, there's things about you I need, but there's things about me that you need. And it helps you actually get deeper in understanding and appreciating who you are and your own identity within your community. Wow. Right? So as much as I've considered leaving, as I've studied all these other evangelical movements and other Christian movements and history and the church and Catholicism, and I can actually say to you, some of my greatest spiritual influences now are Catholics. I also feel a deep sense of appreciation for who we are in our fellowship, what we bring to the table, and all our glaring weaknesses that we need all these other people to learn from, right? It's a both end. It's a tension. Now, the other thing I wanted to just add to that is the importance of pluralism. This is also going to be part of my dissertation work. And when you talked about, recommendations for the church, we're in a different world, right? The average person who's 18 years old who becomes a Christian in high school in our churches can go online and listen to a sermon from N.T. Wright, Mark Driscoll, Scott McKnight, and be influenced theologically by, and should be, these great thinkers, these other great, spiritual thinkers. And it shapes them, right? We're no longer in a place where your Sunday sermon is shaping you entirely. We are being bombarded with all kinds of other influences, and we got to figure out how to navigate that. I think that's going to be healthy for us, but it's creating a lot of attention. So how do we navigate that, right? Learning from all these other people. We're not an isolated community, even if we act like it. So Anyway, there's a lot there to think about.
It's interesting when I talk to my peers who have left, they just couldn't do it, but they respect the fact that I'm staying. And they respect that, and they respect the thought that I have, the way of thinking or whatever. I think that, Jacoby did say in an interview that at times, not leaving the church, but you have to go to a situation where you're going to thrive. And I think even from what I'm seeing in your life, you didn't decide to stay, in the evangelist sort of class of serving. You decided to embrace your gift in terms of teaching, and you're flourishing. And I found that to be true for me. But I love our church. I think there's an incredible moment that we're in, and we can shine. How important is the role of teaching in our churches, and what advice do you have for up-and-coming teachers? Let me preface this for a moment. We've hit this a little bit in this interview. I feel like the whole thing's been seasoned with this. I ask this of every teacher that I have come on, and I just get excited about what each teacher is going to share about what their perspective is about this. So please go. I love it.
Well, gosh, I mean, this is a loaded question, and it's an important question. I think it's the need of the hour question. We built our young reform movement on the role of evangelists. And because we had a global mission to plant churches around the world, phenomenal. I mean, in modern day movements, as far as modern day Christian movements go, what's happened over the last 40 years in the international churches of Christ in particular is really unique. An organized plan to fund and plant and raise up evangelists to spread the gospel. But maturity is part of maturity, and coming out of any reform movement is you've got to mature. You got to grow up. You can't stay the same and expect it to work. And so when you look at models like Ephesians 4 to me is so pivotal, so important to understand. God gave some to be elders, evangelists, teachers, fill in the blank. He gave people different charisms and gifts so that the body of Christ may become mature and complete, right? So let's just think for an example of the role of an evangelist, the role of a teacher. Okay, let's just stick to those two. Evangelists are there to call us to mission, to lead us to mission. Teachers are there to help educate, develop all that we're talking about today, right? Developing the journey, developing faith, building conviction, understanding the scriptures, that role. Now, the problem that we have, and I think this is our universal problem right now in our churches, the call to evangelize doesn't do any good if you don't have a faith worth sharing. We need to be vibrant, engaged, growing, excited Christians at every stage of our life. It looks different as we grow. I think the teachers have to play an integral role in developing that and feeding people. And then when evangelists call us to go share our faith and structure our mission, and then we are, yes. Otherwise, the call to evangelize, it just goes up. People are they tune out because they're discouraged, they're disheartened, they struggle, why would I want to bring anyone into this? Right? We've been talking about this tension in the church now, almost this whole interview, how young people are feeling this, the light's gone out of a lot of people's eyes. To me, building a teaching ministry can really help to fix a lot of that. Now, I will say this. I think we have a lot of work to do over the next decade in the ICOC in particular to develop the teacher, elder, evangelist model of leadership, where people are recognized for the giftedness that they have and what they contribute and are working together in their giftedness to build the church up. And we're not doing that well right now, in my opinion. So I think that's the need and why the teaching ministry is so important. And I think I would say one caveat, we got to understand who we are culturally in the ICOC. In the churches of Christ, they valued education and they sent their people off to build seminaries. And so you have Pepperdine and Harding and Oklahoma Christian and Abilene Christian and Lipscomb and fill in the blanks. So they have the educated and they sent them off to educate others. We don't have that same paradigm. We aren't building universities. I mean, we have the Rocky Mountain School of Ministry, but we're wanting to educate people and keep them within ministry constructs. And so we've got to make space for that and figure out how to do that because we need that education within our churches. And so I think that's a huge part of why the teaching ministry is so vital for our future.
I'll put it this way. This last week, I was around a couple individuals and I had made mention that I went to Harding and somebody else went to Harding. And then there was a comment that was made by someone who heard that. We both went to Harding. And it said, "Oh, did they kill your faith? Or did they they whatever?" And when I first went to Rocky Mountain, like right before I enrolled, I had some ministers tell me, and by the way, these ministers have gone and gotten biblical education now, but they had said, just be careful because seminary is like cemetery. It buries your faith, and specifically with the mainstream churches. I'm like, oh my gosh. And so what's been amazing for me is going to Rocky Mountain and Harding, the relationships, the camaraderie, the next generation. God is developing the next gen right under our nose. and
Yeah.
it's exciting. And we got guys
Yeah.
like you to look up to.
You know, that sentiment about seminary training, whether it's master's level, doctoral level, destroying your faith, it's based in evidence. I mean, the truth is a lot of people go and they lose their faith. I do think it's important to contextualize that, though.
Okay.
The thing that, in my case, has kept me rooted, even in my first year when I was ready to throw in the towel, was vulnerability in relationships. I called, and I know I called 2 or 3, I'm not going to mention their names, but there are 2 or 3 friends in other cities who've been through similar journeys. I called them all the time. Those poor people. I mean, I'm struggling with this. I'm thinking about that. I need to process this. Why haven't we talked about this? What's wrong with our hermeneutics? Why are we, I mean, I put it out there, and I needed to stay rooted relationally as I was processing all these things that do disorient your whole spiritual theological framework.
Yeah.
The people that are islands, that's the ones that get in trouble. If you're not vulnerable, if you're not honest, if you don't find the people you can talk to, you'll work yourself. I mean, you used this statement earlier. I love this statement. You said, water the grass where you are, right? Is that how you said it? Water the grass.
The grass isn't greener on the other side. It's greener where you water it.
It's greener where you water it. Okay. Yeah. So if God has you, if you end up in a school situation, but you're deeply connected to relationships, and you should be. I mean, that's the nature of Christianity. We're processing our hearts, our emotions, our spiritual responses with each other all the time. And when we stop doing that, we get in trouble.
Yeah. I'd be lying if I said that over the last 4 years of doing theological education that there weren't some moments where I just struggled to keep the relational side of Christianity going. I mean, when you're inserting so much knowledge in, and when Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians, I believe he's comparing it to people in other situations. I think when we really try to learn the things of God, I don't think that's necessarily puffing ourselves up. However, the heart behind what we know is important. And I will say, last 4 years, there have been times where I haven't done a great job with that. And I've really had to make a covenant with prayer, about prayer. I've had to make a covenant with being in God's word devotionally. And those are just some individual covenants I've had to make to offset the cost of this journey. And it's a labor of love, sometimes more labor, sometimes more love. So it's not easy, but I think it's worth it. And I just appreciate your example. Let me ask you, what are some upcoming announcements as we get ready to bring it in for a landing? What are some upcoming announcements that you'd like to share? One of which was you've got a lecture series coming up. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a couple really exciting things happening that I think people should know about. And then I will close with my lecture series, but the Teleios Journal, we've recently launched, a few of us in the teaching ministry, along with some scholars in the Greater Stone Campbell heritage, have recently launched a journal that to me is just phenomenal. I mean, it's called Teleios, which those of you who are watching can see it here, but this is the first academic journal that we've kind of rooted out of our fellowship of churches. And people can go to TeleosJournal.com to check that out. Now, it's an academic journal, but it's trying to be accessible. And the goal of it is to promote holistic Christian spirituality. And so what we're doing is we have academic articles and accessible articles and poetry and photography. And I mean, this is really, really neat journal. So the first issue was on justice. The second issue is a collection of articles from Stone Campbell scholars about the International Churches of Christ and how they fit in the Stone Campbell movement. And I think it's the best thing that's been published certainly by us, I think actually anywhere, on the relationship of the International Church of Christ, their history, who they are, how they fit in the Stone Campbell heritage. I did an article I spent 2 years working on the relationship of Kip McKean, one of our influential figures, and how he compares to Alexander Campbell, one of our other historical figures. 2 years I spent on that thing. I mean, so there's a lot of good scholarship in there, and I would really encourage people. I think anyone who wants to stay informed about the International Church of Christ, what's happening, I think they should be subscribing to that journal. So it's TeleosJournal.com. So that's one. The other thing that we launched last year is a new nonprofit, and I don't think a lot of people know about this. There's a new nonprofit called the Disciples Center for Education, where we have people in our fellowship who believe so strongly in the role of education for our future that they're willing to fund people to get PhDs. And that's no small thing, right? Pursuing a PhD, in my case, I had to quit my job. It's full-time study. It's been 4 years. I've got another year to 2 left. So it's typically about a 6-year journey full-time. You can't do that without support. And the Disciple Center for Education, one of the goals is to come alongside people who are gifted, who want to contribute to the future of our fellowship, who want to pursue a PhD, that we want to help make that happen, right? And that's to provide scholarship financially and to provide mentorship. The thing we're talking about with people keeping connected that are in that journey, talking to people, processing that, we're providing that as well. They're also the group that funded the launch of the Teleios Journal. So I think that's exciting. If you want to learn more about that and you're interested in applying for scholarship, disciplescenterforeducation.org is the website. And then, thirdly, my lecture series, my mentor asked me to deliver a 3-part lecture series at Oblate, and that's the school I go to, Oblate School of Theology. It's going to be hybrid, so people can come in person or they can watch online.
Yes.
And it's entitled the same as my dissertation, and I'm going to be kind of broad sharing my dissertation for 3 Thursday nights, October. It's the 2nd or 3rd and 4th week in October, and then one in November on Thursday nights. And if people are interested in learning about that, if they go to the school's website, which is just ost.edu, oblateschooloftheology.edu, and go to the events page, if they scroll down on events to October, they'll see my event. And I think it's $30. You can register and just tune in and learn generally what I'm doing in my research.
I'm going to need to get that. And I'll put that down in the description for folks. Also on the podcast,
sure.
I'll make sure to get something in there as well, because I really think that's going to be very valuable. And you're going to have 3 hours to do it. And it's
1 hour and then Q&A on one night. And it's spread over 3 weeks. So
3 hours over
3 1-hour presentations with an hour of Q&A after. And I think the Q&A is always really important to process that kind of deep research.
I can't wait to just kind of, as this video comes out, just hopefully getting the buzz going for that. And I'm going to promote it. I'll put it in my newsletter. There's no question.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
Dave, I want to tell you, I tell this to all my people. I am just so grateful that you've made time. I know you're studying all the time. I know it's exhausting. It's exhausting to research. I don't know how much sugar you eat or whatever, but
caffeine.
Caffeine. But bro, this is a worthy burden, and you're an example. And bro, I'm going to tell you, and I say this to all my guests, that we are with you and God is for you, my brother.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you for inviting me. I love this dialogue. I appreciate what you're doing. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, if you've been listening throughout the entire video, I want to thank you. I've had folks tell me they've listened to certain videos like 5 times. Cannot believe it. But I just also want to thank so many of you who have been so consistent in subscribing as well. I'm almost to 1,000 subscribers. That's a milestone in the YouTube world or whatever. Almost to 1,000. And by the time this airs, I probably will be at 1,000. So I just want to thank so many of you. Please continue to hit the like, share, and subscribe button. And I will see you guys next time. Thank you.